Hey everybody, this is Mr. Hoffman coming at you again with another APUSH video. Today we're taking a look at topic 7.11, interwar foreign policy. So what we're talking about here is kind of bridging the gap from the end of World War I to the start of World War II in terms of American foreign policy. And World War I is going to have a tremendous influence on what America's foreign policy will be moving into the 1920s and into the 1930s. So remember, World War I, at the time, the most devastating conflict in all of human history. Millions and millions of people have died globally, including well over 100,000 Americans dying in just a year and a half of combat. And note that this was the first war that America had ever fought in Europe. And in many respects, this is an abandonment of what was traditionally relatively isolationist foreign policy for the United States. And so the question then becomes, what will America be doing moving forward? Will it be now forever turning the page and becoming an internationalist nation, an interventionist nation, focused in on the concerns of the globe? Or are we going to revert back to that relative isolationism that we had prior to World War I? Well, that is going to be defined by the presidents of the 1920s. And we're going to see Harding and Coolidge, especially those two guys, playing a critical role in trying to restore American isolationism. Remember, Harding in 1920 runs on the platform of a return to normalcy. And it wasn't just the idea of kind of turning back the clock a little bit in terms of domestic policies, trying to turn back the clock in terms of progressive advancements, but also on the global stage. Harding did not follow the same beliefs as Woodrow Wilson. Harding was opposed to the League of Nations, like many other Republicans, and did not share Wilson's vision of the U.S. being a global leader in actively promoting world peace. So Harding backs away from that, and so will Coolidge following later. So we kind of go back to this era of relative isolationism, but note the word is relative because it's not 100% isolationism. First off, it's not 100% isolationism because it's we still have global trade, but in terms of a military and diplomatic perspective, there's also going to be exceptions to that rule. For example, the United States hosting the Washington Conference, and what this does in 1921 is create an international agreement to limit the size of navies. Now, remember, militarism was one of the causes of World War I. The bigger the size of the military, the more likely you are to use it. So if you are reducing the size of navies globally, then you are going to be less likely to go to war. This is also going to be a group that's going to support an open door policy in China across the board. So the idea being is you break down those spheres of influence. Therefore, you are reducing rivalries in China. And remember, imperialist-based rivalries were also one of the causes for World War I. So that's going to be significant. In addition, later on in the decade, we're going to see America sign off on the Kellogg-Briand Pact, which is going to be an international agreement to outlaw war. Now, you might look at that and go, oh, gosh, outlaw war, that's, pretty pie in the sky, pretty naive to think that that could ever happen. Well, obviously, especially given the paradox that, in order to enforce a law banning war, you would theoretically have to use war to enforce that law. But anyway, don't get too hung up on the pragmatic aspects of it. But really, it's an important symbolic message that the United States is going to be a part of, saying that once again, that last war was so horrific, so awful, so traumatizing for the globe that we cannot have war in the future. In other words, you cannot use war as a means to settle international disputes. So what's interesting about the 1920s policies is that on the whole, we're going to be isolationists. We will never sign the Treaty of Versailles. We will never join the League of Nations. But in a few cases, we are taking some of those lessons that we learned from Wilson's 14 points, and they are applied a little bit in some of these agreements that are made. Now, another item that is going to be defining the interwar years will be economic for sure. First off, keep in mind that as we go through the 1920s, there's going to be more and more economic investment in Latin America. You've got folks like the United Fruit Company, for example, that are going to really, really, really be flexing their economic muscles. And what this means is that as there are more economic interests in Latin America, then that means there's going to be more political influence in Latin America and an expanded willingness to use our military power to have friendly governments in place to allow American businesses to profit. Now, there's a double-edged sword to this for sure. Yes, you want an environment where American businesses can be as profitable as possible, but at the same time, though, is it morally right to basically subvert democracy in some of these other countries and prop up, in many cases, really awful, brutal dictators that are on the take from American businesses in order to secure that American profitability? Well, one thing that we do know for sure is that this is not going to endear the United States in many respects to our southern Latin American neighbors. It's going to further this idea that America is selfish, it is hypocritical in terms of its beliefs in democracy, and views the rest of the Western Hemisphere as just territories to exploit for America's own gain. Beyond Latin America, we're also going to be seeing U.S. expanding its interest in global oil, particularly in the Middle East. Now, granted, the United States has a lot of oil reserves, and that's going to continue. But you got to understand, remember, the 1920s is going to see this major increase in demand for oil. Oil for heating homes, gasoline for cars, and all sorts of things. So the United States is going to start to make its foreign policy also connected to our interest in obtaining oil globally. Something else that is going to be noticeable, remember this is the 1920s, Republicans in power, and even though, yes, we have moved towards an income tax, there's still a desire amongst Republicans to keep the tariff rates relatively high in order to be protectionist in nature for American businesses. However, this will lead to some, animus between us and many foreign countries, because remember, if you keep tariffs high on foreign countries, then that hurts their businesses, and then that they tend to put tariffs on us, which hurts our businesses to some extent. So there's obviously a trade-off on that for sure. And when you're talking about possibly hurting international trade, this is going to be especially problematic given the realities of the debt that is existing globally at this time, once again, as a result of the end of World War I. Now, you got to remember, during the war, the United States is going to be loaning the Allies millions and millions and millions of dollars, and then eventually into the billions of dollars. Now, that's going to help the Allies win the war. Now, note, when the war is over, we know in the Treaty of Versailles that the Allies are going to punish Germany greatly in a financial sense by forcing the Germans to pay billions of dollars in reparations to them. So you've got this chain of debt that exists at the end of World War I. You've got the Germans owing the British and the French billions of dollars, and you've got the British and the French owing the U.S. billions of dollars. So there is a clear chain of debt there. Now, as we go through the 1920s, Germany's economy is going to go through some very, very rough patches, and that's putting it mildly. You will see, especially as we start to get towards the end of the 1920s, you start to see the German mark just absolutely deteriorate in terms of value. You have crippling inflation. You've got prices that are changing by the hour in some of the major cities in Germany. It just becomes madness. And part of what's fueling this is the reality that despite pleas from the Germans and even the British and the French, there's not going to be any forgiveness of this debt. So here's kind of how this works, okay? The Germans are asking the French and the British, please stop squeezing us for the reparations money. We don't have it. The only way we can pay you back is with devalued printed marks that don't mean much anymore. Our economy is going right down the tubes. Well, the French and the British were open to forgiving those debts. However, they still owed money to the U.S. And so they would tell the Germans, listen, we would be willing to help you, but we still owe the U.S. money. So we need to collect your debts to pay off the Americans. And so you've got the French and the British coming to the United States saying, hey, can you, ease up on, on the forgiveness of the debt? And you got to understand who's president by the late 1920s. You got Calvin Coolidge. And Calvin Coolidge is going to be, depending on how you want to view it, either the most principled president in terms of financial affairs or the most stingy president when it comes to financial affairs that we're ever going to have. As far as Coolidge is concerned, a contract's a contract, a deal is a deal, a loan is a loan, and if you borrow money, you will pay back every last nickel of that debt. In other words, there will be zero forgiveness from the United States government. Well, that's a problem. That is a major problem. So with no ease on the pressure on France and Britain, that means that there's no ease on the pressure of Germany. Now, as if this was not already problematic, then we get even slicker with what is going to be known as the Dawes Plan. Now, do not confuse this Dawes Plan with the Dawes Plan of the 1880s dealing with, the Dawes Act dealing with the use of Indian lands. What this is a way to try to solve the issue in terms of debt. So what the Dawes Plan includes is basically having American private banks loan money to the German government. And then with that loaned money, then the German government can then begin to pay back more of the reparations to the French and the British, which then allows them to be able to pay the U.S. government money that it's owed. So, in other words, it allows for a movement in clearing the ledgers, so to speak, financially, and forcing everybody to pay up their loans as Coolidge demands. And at the same time, in a very, very Coolidgean, if that's a word, kind of a move, it also allows American banks to profit because we're making these loans to Germany with interest. So not only does our government get its money, American banks are going to be making a profit as well. So from a Coolidge perspective, this is a win-win. The government gets its money back, American businesses make more money, win-win-win. However, this comes at a price. By having this method of forced debt payments and American banks kind of greasing the wheels for this, it certainly sends the message that America does not really have much humanity in terms of dealing with these issues, and that it seems that America was much more willing to try to make a buck off of the financial suffering of European nations rather than focus in on doing what might be viewed as a humane thing, given that America was very prosperous, had a lot of money at the time. To be forgiving with those debts could then, help these other countries out in the long term. So some have even viewed this as another piece in the puzzle that kind of leads to German resentment that, of course, will boil over into the start of World War II. All right? So with that, we will leave it there for now. We'll see you next time.